Hey there. The topic that I'm sharing about is simply a perspective that I stumbled upon in my thoughts and that I'm prepared to try on myself. And I wanted to share about it because it feels really freeing. It feels really right. So here's what I'm looking at. In the behaviors of other people, there are certain behaviors that are very plainly showing as a way to avoid a trauma. And I want to just talk about some of what those are. How can you tell? These are the behaviors. Okay, this is how I'll put it. These are the behaviors that someone would exhibit when they are trying to avoid feeling a pain that they are not prepared to feel. Meaning, this is their adaptive defense, which is due to trauma. So, how can you tell that someone is in an adaptive defense? Anytime you see these behaviors being exhibited, you know that someone is in an adaptive defense. Why is this important? So we can shame them, blame them, call them out? No. So that we can check ourselves and make sure that we're not having expectations of somebody who's in a defensive posture. So, if we have an agenda, such as, I'm going to take the example of the guy on my page who is advocating to stop circumcision. It's a wonderful cause because it's important that people understand that circumcision is a trauma and it's unnecessary and it's wrong to keep perpetuating it. That's important for people to know. But in the process of informing people of that, you have people who are saying, well, I'm not regretful of getting my kids circumcised and things like that, right? And then you have other people saying, these people who don't get it. And I want to say this, that if someone is protecting themselves from feeling the effects of a trauma, what that might look like is denial. Okay? So instead of us getting frustrated that these people can't hear us, they don't get it, they're not letting themselves see something that's so obvious. We can instead say to ourselves, oh, that person is protecting themselves from feeling a very painful thing that they will have to feel when they let this truth in. And besides denial, other things that we could see them doing might be arguing for their point of view, justifying their behaviors, puffing up their chest, pretending to be something they're not, gossiping about somebody else, pointing a finger at and shaming somebody else, blaming somebody else. Let's see if my oracle can help us with some more. Running away. It's not necessarily that a person is a coward to run away. It just means that that's their defensive strategy to avoid feeling a trauma that they're not prepared to feel. We want people to have ways of coping with things, right? We want people to survive. That's how they survive, is to have a way to deal with it until they're ready to deal with it. A trigger. That's an obvious one. That's what the bucket said. The bucket said activated by transit. So just coming in contact with somebody can trigger them. So I have an example of that. I've done a lot of work on myself. I'm pretty comfortable in my day-to-day life. I have confidence in who I am. When I have something that I'm healing come up, of course that I'm seeing through the lens of that, and I may have to sit with some emotion and process. I'm still human. But day-to-day life, pretty happy. So what happens a lot of times is just by being happy, I can trigger somebody. Somebody else can feel threatened by my happiness because some of their defense would be to compare, and they have to kind of try to take me down a little bit or project onto me in order to make themselves feel safe again. Okay, so doing that. But an example is I stopped at the store the other day, run in the store and get to the register. And because there was a couple of clearance items, like this little wind-up bunny chicken, it was on clearance after Easter, 75% off, right? And some chocolates, maybe they were regular like $1, so they were going to be like 33 cents or something. So they must have been $1.25. But anyway, so I grabbed these things on my way to the register also. And the cashier rings up the first item that is supposed to be at a discount, but it doesn't ring up at a discount. And then she has to manually override the price. And then she does that and then realizes that there's 2 more of those same items on the table ready to be checked out. Like, she's doing the checkout, right? Like, she's the cashier. And I've already put all my items up there, and she got mad at me. She literally goes, "Oh, you didn't tell me there's 2 more?" Like, they were literally on the counter in front of her, just like the first one she picked up. There were 3 bags of chocolate and 1 little bouncy chicken. And so, I mean, I was just like taken aback for a moment that I just said, I didn't know. like how am I supposed to anticipate what you're doing or not doing or how it's supposed to be done or whatever? Like, my concern is this item ringing up the price that it's supposed to be, because otherwise I'm not buying it. Like, I'm literally just buying it for the discount. And so she's like a bit flustered from that. Okay, fine. Now when she rings up the little chick, it also does not ring up on clearance. And I mentioned to her, because I can see on the screen on my side what price they're ringing up. And I'm watching, because that is what I do. Anytime I'm shopping clearance, I always watch, because I've been screwed over many times in the past when I didn't watch. And then I get home and the discount didn't show up, right? Okay, so I mentioned it to her. I said, "Oh, that one didn't ring up." And she goes, well, just wait a minute. I was like, "Oh, okay. I mean, it's okay." I said, "Everything's fine." She goes, "I don't need that." So I couldn't win, right? Like, I was just thinking, like, okay, this lady is very on edge, very traumatized, very triggered at this moment. And I couldn't, like, get myself together enough in that moment to actually do what she needed, which was acknowledge her feelings. She was feeling, like, insulted that she was messing up. Hold on. Very, very activated by the fact that I was just, like, breezing through her store. And for whatever reason, she was very sensitive about not doing things the most efficient way or whatever. And maybe she felt, like, frustrated that there was more work for her or something. And if I could have validated that in that moment, if I could have said, "Oh, I know this is turning out to be a lot more work than you probably need to have on you right now," or something like that, instead of my saying, "It's okay." Because she took my saying, "It's okay," as condescension, when really what she was feeling was some sort of frustration or burden, right? So if I had had the presence of mind and the practice with what I know now about dealing with trauma, I might have reinforced the acknowledgement of what she was making me feel was likely what she was feeling, which was a little bit confused and frustrated. and as if she was trying to make me feel as if I was doing something wrong when I wasn't. So she must have felt like she was doing something wrong by not getting it right or whatever. Anyway, she snapped at me about this price, and I said, well, I was just saw it ring up on this side. She goes, yeah, it's ringing up at $1.25. I'm like, I know, but it's actually supposed to be 75% off, or I'm not going to buy it. And then she just took it off. And then she added the two other things that were discounted in by just adding them to the amounts together and then putting them in at that amount. Like, okay. And then we finished, and then I was like, well, I'm not really sure what you did about this chicken item. And she's like, well, I just took it off and I didn't put it back on. And now at this point, I was in a dilemma because I was like, I want to pay for this shit. I do not want to take this item without paying. That is not my style. But I also definitely know that it's not going to go well if I tell her that she needs to put it on my order so I can pay for it. So I just went silent and went, okay. I'm just going to take this as my reward for dealing with this moment. Without trying to shame, blame her, put her in her place, or anything like that. I just, okay, getting through this. And that's what it is sometimes, right? Like, it's not personal. I didn't do anything wrong. She's just having a moment, and it's happening as a result of my energy coming to confront her. And my energy says, hey, you believe something that's not true about yourself. Let's expose that so that you can let go of it, because you're perfectly worthy as a person, and you can make mistakes and still be worthy. Because that's what my energy believes about me. So that's what my energy can just call people up to just by being there, right? Because energy speaks. We don't have to use words to pass along information, right? All right, so that's an example of activated by transit, as my bucket puts it. But that's someone who's in trauma, and that's an obvious one, right? So, but if we just look at each other like this, right? Sometimes it's going to be something very subtle in the way that they're communicating, where that they're dancing around the truth, where they're not being forthcoming. These could be indications that they're avoiding feeling something. Let's see if the bucket has any other examples for us before we close this out. I'm going to obviously have to edit this video before I put it up. Oh, it says narcissist. So sometimes making the selfish decision can actually be an indication of avoiding feeling a trauma. So instead of calling that person out as selfish, we could assume that they are in a traumatized state, in a defensive adaptation that they're using to survive. And we can assume that it would be rude of us to try to take that from them. And I really think this is a powerful thing to use as a perspective to navigate people in life, because one thing I've learned is when we give people the space to see themselves in, when we're not making them defend themselves to us because we're calling them out, when we're not shaming or blaming them or pointing fingers at them, when we're not calling them up to our expectations or telling them how they've disappointed us or calling them names or any of those things, when we're not doing that, we are literally giving them the space that they would need in order to reflect on their own self and their own behavior. Right? Like if someone's being selfish, and I don't call them out and I don't feel offended by it, and I just observe that that's what's happening, and I know that that is a defensive posture to protect themselves in the traumatized state that they are harboring, right? And I just stay silent. I'm an observer. I'm looking at them with no judgment. I have an open heart when I'm doing so. That right there, energetically, is the equivalent to my heart saying to their heart, oh, I honor you and the boo-boo that you are dealing with. And that message that I'm sending to their heart in that moment of silence between us gives them an opportunity to then, at their own comfort level, when they are ready, if they are ready, to introspect, to look at themselves and their own behavior. And that is the only thing that is going to work if they're not actually outright asking you for advice on how to help themselves out of this situation of trauma. Because we can't change anyone else's behavior. We don't control other people. And if we are doing all those other things, we are actually taking away from their opportunity to see themselves. They could literally not see themselves if they're too busy defending themselves. They could literally not see themselves if they are too busy justifying their behavior or feeling sad or bad about disappointing you. Let's see, what other behaviors would indicate if we see someone doing something in a pattern, like I do this and they do that. They always have this response to that situation. Whenever we notice that, then we know this person is avoiding feeling a traumatized state. That's a defensive posture, because we know cycles are coping mechanisms, right? Or cycles in behavior, I should say. Bitterness. Okay, so we see someone who's bitter. Oh, this is a good one for me to explore, because I do have a couple people in my life that are bitter right now, and it's been uncomfortable for me to see them in that state. So actually, what they're showing me is that they are not prepared to feel a certain level of pain that is associated with a trauma that they feel in accordance with what they feel bitter over. Oh, and I know what bitterness is tied to. Bitterness is tied to having an expectation or a story about something that is actually ultimately not true, because the reality doesn't live up to it, and then we can get bitter, right? Because like, oh, I wanted this, or I expected this, or this meant this to me, and that didn't happen, and I put everything into that, and I believed that, and life should have served that up to me, and now it didn't, and I'm bitter. It's like, okay, yes, bitter comes from you having an expectation and a story. And so what this means when we witness it in someone else is the story they were telling themselves about life was not true, and they have now been disillusioned. So when we witness someone who's bitter, they're actually in process of discovering. They're like the one step away. All they have to do now is feel the feelings, accept that it's there, and feel the feelings. That's what they're on. So they're like in process of healing. We definitely don't want to interrupt the person who's bitter, because at least they've acknowledged and they have validated themselves. They know why they feel the way they feel. And what they have to do is now accept that they feel it and then be present with the feelings. Those are the two steps that they have left. It's a wonderful place to be in if you're looking at the bigger picture of healing, right? It's halfway through. Regret. Okay, we see someone in regret. So instead of trying to tell them, like, oh, you don't have to regret, no regrets, why would you have regret? Like, if someone's feeling regret, it literally means that they are, let's see, in process of feeling. Maybe they didn't know that they could sit with it fully and be present with it to embrace it all at once. So they're feeling it a little bit at a time. They are in process of feeling the feelings that are associated with something. So regret is kind of on that fourth step of healing. And it's something we wouldn't want to interrupt, right? We know how important it is to be present with the feelings. If anything, we could have empathy for that person, which would amplify the feeling, which would make them notice it more, which would maybe give them the opportunity to feel it more. Got two more here. We talked about the cycles. So if you notice somebody in a cycle, right, they still haven't perhaps acknowledged why the cycle's there, so they're not into the process of healing yet. They're still in the loop. Oh, canceled. Isn't this an interesting one? Okay, so if you see somebody, this is so relevant with our culture right now, so I don't even know what's going to come out of my mouth right now, but I'm eager to explore this topic. Okay, so canceled. We see people who are feeling offended by something certain, and something that's occurring outside of themselves, and they would like to cancel it, meaning that thing is written off. Okay, so a lot of things are going on here. Well, first of all, they're taking it personal. Second of all, they're probably recruiting others to their view, and there probably are others if there is a cancellation that actually happens. So it's like mob mentality. So it's like a collective wound. It's like, oh, I feel offended by this. Don't you feel offended by this? Yes, I feel offended by this too. What's really happening is they feel offended, right? They are telling a story that gives them reason to feel hurt. And then they're using this as the reason that they feel hurt, when in actuality, in this case, why they feel hurt is likely not the thing that they're pointing at. So canceled is actually a detour in the healing process. It's like saying, I feel hurt and that's the reason. It's a form of denial. It's a form of avoidance. It's a form of perpetuating a suppression. It's basically a lie, but it's a lie that you get other people to believe too. And then the results can actually be that our culture is shaped by that lie. And this is not a foreign concept, because it's literally what we're all coming out of when we look at things like the punishment and reward parenting paradigm, or the Ferber method, right? The Ferber method was where a doctor suggested that you could spoil your child by responding to their need, and so instead you should let them cry. And it's like that spread, and people believed that and tried that and did that and damaged their kids with it. And that's what canceled is too. It's like this little lie that spreads, and then like people believe it, and then it does affect something, right? So it's actually a very damaging way that you do see people dealing with their traumatized state, but it is stemming from an extreme avoidance of feeling the trauma, feeling the real reason for their hurt, right? They're not even willing to acknowledge the real reason for their hurt. So they're actively in avoidance. That's what canceled is. Okay, so this is interesting because when I look at it that way, and we look at the manifestation of canceled as a part of our culture as of late, in the past few years or whatever, what it shows is that it's a manifestation of a collective coping mechanism, which is to avoid and shift blame and project our pain onto someone else. It's just that it's getting louder so that we can notice it, so that it can crumble, so that certain intellectual people can see through this. Certain people who have the presence of mind, or who have worked through their own version of it, or have experienced it themselves and then all of a sudden seen the truth of things. there will be people who will build the bridge from this coping mechanism out to freedom. And once that's done, people will be able to do that. But like first it had to get loud enough so that people would understand that, look, we need to find a way for these people to get to peace. So first of all, it's going to get loud and uncomfortable so that we're motivated to do so. Like anything in our culture that we've outgrown, which has served its purpose, which we've learned all we can learn from it, right? So that's, I guess, something we're still learning from, right? Because we do still see that a little bit out there. But it's kind of funny because, whatever you are putting on someone else in general, right? People who are pointing fingers at other people in general cannot do that without being the thing that they're pointing their finger at. So people don't realize that this form of coping with trauma is actually hypocrisy. So here's another one. Hypocrisy is a form of avoiding feeling the pain of trauma. Hypocrisy. In actuality, hypocrisy is existing all around us in everything. Because everything that's true, the opposite is also true. Hypocrisy is part of life, for real. So you can also see it in things like this. Interesting. All right, so I really like this, and I'm going to kind of take this point of view with me throughout my day as I go out and do some things today. And I'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll add some more at the end of my day, any examples or experience that I have with it before I post this video. What are your thoughts? Can you think of any other behaviors that when you see them would indicate that somebody is actually avoiding feeling some of their traumatized feelings? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and I'd love to further this discussion. Hey there. Okay, I've gone through my day. After my day of experiencing the perspective I mentioned in this video, I have a couple things to add. And one is the obvious addition to my list would be addiction. When you see someone in addiction, you can know that that is an indication that they are in a defensive adaptation, and what they're trying to do is avoid feeling some sort of trauma and pain, which is due to a lack of connection. That's what addiction is based in, a lack of connection. Okay, so when we see someone who's in addiction, we know that they lack connection. Now, that makes addiction a really difficult thing, right? Because when someone is in addiction, it's very difficult to have them in your life because they're not taking care of themselves. They're not taking responsibility for certain things that they should. And they're sometimes abusive, sometimes, thieving, sometimes just making your life very difficult and putting a lot of burdens on the people around them. So, but in actuality, what they actually need is connection. So if at all possible, it's important not to abandon people that you love who are in addiction. But it is also important to make sure you keep your boundaries. So if you are going to sink yourself by having someone close to you when they're in addiction, then you must give yourself the space, right? Because it doesn't make sense to allow yourself to go down with their ship. And the other thing was, I mentioned regret. And what I was realizing about regret was actually regret can also be a cover emotion. A cover emotion. So I talked about it in reference of if somebody's in regret, it means they're feeling, they're on the step of feeling, which is one of the steps of healing, and that's great. But what I realized is actually someone could be feeling regret as a way to avoid feeling the thing that they would actually have to feel. Right? So regret can actually hold a place for us in avoiding what the actual trauma is. So sometimes regret could also be an indication that somebody's on a different step, but I think it would still always show, if it was a pattern, if it was repeating, then it would show that it is part of a strategy being used to avoid feeling a trauma. So why is it important to have this point of view? I think it's important because this perspective helps us not take things personal, lead with kindness and compassion, because we don't want to lose our humanity, especially as humanity is going through quite a shift at this time. A lot of people are going to be feeling a lot more pressure to let go of these things, to resolve these things, to come to a more true understanding of what's going on with them, to forgive, and to really be sovereign and look to self for love and all the missing kind of stuff. So as we all kind of go through this transition, when we look at each other, it would be helpful if we were using our compassion and kindness. And I remember in the earlier part of this recording, I mentioned something like, you can't call something out without being that thing. And that has to do with the mirroring and the fact that when you call something out, you are likely being that thing at least in the moment, if you're not that thing all the time. And it's like, it's a projection, right? Because this is a holographic life. Like we are experiencing the holographic output of our own energy body. And so it's just very interesting. So if you start having kindness and compassion for the people outside of you who are going through something, who are dealing with trauma, who are in the process of healing or in the process of avoiding their feelings, whatever it may be, to have kindness and compassion for them means that you would have kindness and compassion for a version of you that would be in the same position they are in. And ultimately, we want to be loving all the parts of ourselves. Because anytime we are at war within ourselves, this is putting us in the position of the lower density energies, getting stuck, being outwardly at war would be the manifestation of having an inner war. And war is very destructive. And we've learned all that we needed to learn from war. We've done that for long enough. So the only thing you could possibly do from perpetuating war at this point would be just like to keep doing something that's already been done. And at this point on Earth, it's more likely that your soul came to experience the fact that we can be conscious creators on Earth. We can play with our magic in a way that is positive and creates the win-win-win for all. Like all the challenges that we face can be solved just through the creativity that we have and the belief in ourselves and the understanding of how things work. I mean, the freedom that we have is not for nothing. And, that's why it's worth doing shadow work. That's why it's worth pushing out of your comfort zones. That's why it's worth rectifying things and redeeming self and taking the high road. Because you get to the point where you realize I'm creating this. And then it's like, oh, I'm creating this, right? So just having compassion for your fellow man, I think, is part of that. And when you have compassion for your fellow man, it's usually a result of having had compassion for yourself. So if you are still in resentment and pointing fingers and judgment about people who are in these behaviors that we've discussed, it's understandable, it's very human, but it's also an indication that you have something within you to work through. So it works both ways, right? Okay, so what do you think of this perspective? Do you have anything to add? It's really late. I'm doing this in the middle of the night after a long day. And I'm going to just get to the editing part so maybe it can upload while I sleep. So let me know what you think.